We're going to be talking about Paul today and Jesus next week. And when I originally put this together, which was 18 years ago now, I was really looking, I used to preface it, and I began this series by prefacing by saying, specifically sort of critiquing Paul and Jesus, but saying as Christians, because we spend most of our time in the New Testament reading Paul's letters, where Paul is largely giving us sort of a new law, a new way that we're supposed to be. And then Jesus, of course, in the Gospels, who is our example of perfection, that and for various other cultural reasons, as Christians, at least in the West, we've tended to then read all the Bible in such a way that we sort of feel that everything has to be exactly as it seems on the surface, right? That we're not reading it as literature oftentimes, but like some sort of handbook. And so when we would come to stories like where Rebekah helps Jacob steal the blessing from his brother by deceiving his father, I have read and I have heard preachers say that was God's intention, that deception was a part of God's will, because God had promised Rebekah that the younger should rule the elder. As we've looked at it and seen, that's probably not the case. That the author, in fact, makes a very strong, the biblical text makes a very strong argument against that sort of behavior and warns us that this kind of behavior has lasting impact on families and communities, this sort of deception and the ends justifying the means. But we miss that. We miss that if we just assume if the Bible says it, that must be the way it is, without getting behind it and interrogating the text, as it were. And it's been great. Many of you, well, we've got a wide variety. I was going to say many of you come from different backgrounds, but the reality is we have a wide variety of backgrounds here. And that's been really wonderful in our conversation, and I'm grateful for that. But we are going to tackle Paul and Jesus because we've got the time. And obviously we can't look at everything about Paul or Jesus in one now down to 45-minute session. But I wanted to focus in particular here on Paul as a person. What do you know about Paul? When I mention Paul, what is your immediate reaction? And in this, by the way, he's the one in the middle. The manuscript doesn't identify who the other two are. He's usually identified as being bald, somewhat quirky looking because of comments made in, I think it's 2 Corinthians maybe, that his detractors are against him because he doesn't look the way they think it should be. Great, Cassie shared in the chat that he's the convert, sort of the convert par excellence, the road to Damascus experience. And he's zealous. What about other folks? What other comments?
I love his writing. I think it was very, very lyrical and brilliant as far as being able to articulate what was going on, but what was within him.
So you're a fan of his writing?
No, of his writing, but certainly not when I read the text this week of how soulless he was. I mean, it's kind of like, I always think of somebody that can write like that as always having had some kind of spiritual being. And to see the opposite, this binary kind of thing, is kind of shocking.
Well, we'll look at it and we'll see how is it that different. And Paul's writing, that beauty of it and his argument, and there's all sorts of critical details. As a biblical scholar, we would dig into the question about what's being written, what's being transcribed, and so forth. But it does across the text here pretty clear. He really understood his rhetoric. Right? He knew how to use words. He knew how to build arguments and to make arguments. In morning prayer, we've been in Romans the last few weeks up until this week, and really strong arguments being made quite persuasively. Other impressions, thoughts about Paul?
Well, I've always found the story to be very hopeful, as I'm a flawed individual, but yet I can change too.
Right. So the conversion aspect, that it provides hope. It doesn't matter how far you go. And
Yes.
Paul talks about that, right? How extreme he was. Anybody else?
He came a long way from that to, our main instructor when it comes to Christianity.
Right. Well, Kathy's got the great point there. The main instructor, right? So 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament are from Paul or attributed to Paul.
One thing you'll probably explain, but I always, years ago, had the impression that his conversion, it happened quickly, but then he immediately became a teacher. But in 9, verse 23, it says, after many days had gone by. Well, with a worldly view, I thought maybe that meant a couple of weeks. I think it meant years.
We'll see that. Paul in Galatians, which is where he sort of lays out most of his first person account, talks about just taking himself out into the wilderness. And we'll talk about that for sure. Yeah, so we've got, many people will talk about, and some people disparagingly, that Paul was the one who shaped Christianity. There are a lot of people today in Christianity who don't like Paul. They don't like the things that Paul says. They don't necessarily like the way he says them. His letters are the earliest text we have. Even Mark, which is considered our earliest gospel, probably antedates Paul's writings. Paul was born somewhere around the turn of the Common Era, and he was active for about 20 years. His conversion was probably somewhere around 30-31, and he was probably executed, actually more like 30 years of experience, executed somewhere around 60. But this is, I keep saying around because this is part of the challenge, is we don't have a lot, well, depending on how you look at it. From an ancient perspective, we've got a lot of firsthand information from Paul himself. But it's not tied down. He never sat down and wrote an autobiography. Acts gives us a lot of details. They're not quite lined up exactly with what we have from Paul. To finish sort of the scholarly bit, a lot of scholars, there's a lot of debate about whether or not all of the letters attributed to Paul are truly from Paul. I will say right up front, Hebrews, which historically in the late antique and through the medieval period to the modern period was considered Pauline, was actually never in antiquity. It was not. I mean, already by the 2nd century, there's question about it. I think very strongly that Hebrews is not from Paul. I just realized that was a passage I meant to include in our notes today. But so these other letters are the so-called disputed Pauline epistles. So 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, and so forth, 1 and 2 Timothy. I'm not a New Testament scholar per se, right? I mean, I have not made that my primary focus. I will say this, it raises some problems. I mean, some folks would like to say, well, in antiquity, they didn't worry about it so much, except you've got in the disputed Pauline epistles, I, Paul, an apostle, write this to you. Somebody's trying to deceive us if that's not really Paul. So that's a challenge for me as a faithful person. But I will sort of give you my fallback position, as it were, which is this. All of this was ultimately determined by the church through prayer and contemplation to be a part of our canon. And so I don't think, as with any of the Bible, and trust me, there are bits of the Bible like the end of Judges that I really wish we could just ignore. And we do half the time. But they're there. They're in the canon, and that means we need to wrestle with them and take them seriously. Luther wasn't a huge fan of James, but to the best of my knowledge, he never actually suggested it be taken out of the canon, just that he didn't feel it was, he didn't like the fact that it was in the canon. Maybe I'm misremembering my Luther. So, so Acts gives us a lot about Paul, but it really, we probably need to look at his own letters more, and we'll get to that in the next slide. But just a couple of things more to set a context. He was born in Tarsus, which, if you think of the Mediterranean and the finger of Crete pointing up to that corner of Anatolia, that Tarsus was right up there. It was, throughout antiquity, a very strong and important city. There was a major university there. Not obviously like, Kentucky or Penn State, but or even Harvard for that matter, but more like Alexandria and Rome and so forth. He, at some point relatively early, went to Jerusalem. So he was born in a Jewish family. He did go to Jerusalem. We'll talk about his learning there. Acts says that he was a Roman citizen, and certainly he appeals to go before the emperor. That's, scholars debate about exactly whether he was truly a Roman citizen, which was fairly rare in the Eastern Empire, or because he was a member of the Jewish community. These different ethnic communities in the Roman Empire in the first century were granted autonomy and allowed to largely live and govern themselves. That's why we see in the Gospels this back and forth between the Jewish leadership and Pilate and so forth. It's reflecting that tension over leadership. So, as a member of a Palatuma, he would have had some certain rights. He apparently was an artisan, a skilled worker of leather work and tent making. That seems to have come from his father. That comes into play. I think it's in Ephesus, right, where he stays for a few years as a tent maker. And I remember growing up that language, we would hear about that on missionary Sundays at my church, where we would have missionaries from different places around the world, especially communist countries at the time, we would hear that they were tent makers. So they might be working in the oil and gas industry, say, but they were really there to preach and teach, but they were using the skills that they had. And so that phrase comes from Paul. Okay, so let's look at what the texts say about Paul. I gave you, I sort of assigned, as it were, a couple of passages from the beginning of Acts 6 and 9, I think it was. But already I think Lois has referred us to other bits of Acts as well. Here in Acts 22, we have from the mouth of Paul saying, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, brought up in this city," that is Jerusalem, "at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today." So here's Paul rhetorically to, I can't remember who made the point about his rhetoric and his skill, saying, look, if you want to be, and he uses this trope again and again because we see it in Philippians and Galatians, you want to play the card of being a good Jew and what it means to be a Jew. Well, I've got that card, and I'm telling you there's still something more to learn. So I'll finish these passages and then we'll have some discussion on it. So he says in Philippians, this is again his writing, "I was circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless." Although we could compare that with what he says about Romans and how, is anyone blameless under the law? And then in Galatians, which really, the first 3 chapters of Galatians are really quite strong in terms of getting a sense of him trying to articulate his background. "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the tradition of my ancestors." Does seeing all of that together in one slide shape your view of Paul at all? So did all of you have this sense of his Jewishness? I mean, part of what Paul's really emphasizing here is his connection with what became which was in the first century the dominant strain of Judaism, what would become Rabbinic Judaism. Mac, did you want to share something?
No, not really a lot. I was just looking at it. It's interesting how in the various places that he is establishing his credentials before he starts on what his mission is.
Right. He in particular, right, the rhetoric in Acts, the context is very much he's preaching to Jews. So he's trying to establish that for them. And in Galatians and some of the other in the epistles that we get, because these are for diaspora communities. Remember these, where does his ministry start? When he goes into a city or a town out in outside of Judea, where does he go first? Anybody remember? He goes to synagogues first, right? And it's incredibly logical because Jesus was a Jew, right? The Messiah coming, the whole buildup, the whole explanation, the whole justification for understanding, the contextualization for understanding Jesus as Messiah is Judaism, right? It's the prophets, it's scripture. And so on the one hand, there's a lot less background work, so to speak, he has to do in a Jewish community. He can just say, remember Isaiah, remember Joel, remember all these passages. Jesus is the fulfillment of these promises. On the other hand, too, there were a lot of what are referred to as God-fearers. So there were a lot of Gentiles who were really intrigued by Judaism. And so beginning in the synagogues was a place to meet those people. And then it seems, sort of reading the text backwards, so this comes back to how we read the Bible, we read what Paul is pushing against so that we can get a sense of what his opponents' arguments were. And it seems that others were saying, yeah, he claims to be a Jew, but not really. And in fact, there's a sort of a modern counterpart to this today that I've often been engaged in this discussion, the question, are Jews for Jesus really Jews? Right?
Mm-hmm.
When I would teach Intro to Judaism, I would talk with my students, most of whom were Jewish, about what I would ask them, what is required to be a Jew? What can you believe or do or not do and still be Jewish? And the reality is most folks believed and will articulate, I mean, you could be a Buddhist and Jewish. You don't have to believe in God. You can still be Jewish. You need to be observant. You don't have to be. I mean, even the most Orthodox Jews that I know, when I talk with them about people who are ethnically Jewish, but do nothing religious, my Orthodox friends will say, they're just bad Jews, right? But if I talk with them about someone who was ethnically Jewish, maybe even raised in an observant Jewish home, but they believe Jesus is the Messiah, they're not a Jew anymore, right? So it's a very contemporary debate that in many ways Paul is dealing with it, because the Jewish people around are saying, well, if this guy's persuaded about this guy Jesus, then he must not have been a very good Jew. And Paul is saying, no, I got this. I mean, this is where I came from. Now, there's as many types of Judaism in antiquity as there is today. Dead Sea Scrolls have shown us that, for instance. But Paul in particular was from the Pharisaical tradition. Now, we see the Pharisees all the time in the Gospels. They don't exactly come out great. But how would you characterize the Pharisees?
Legalistic.
Why would you say legalistic? That's good. Why would you say that?
They're always saying, hey, you're not supposed to do this on the Sabbath, and they're kind of like the watchdogs.
Great. Yeah, that's often our impression, right? And that linguistically comes down to us, doesn't it? So if we say somebody's being Pharisaical, is that a positive or a negative?
It's
That's a negative.
not positive.
Yeah, right. Well,
They were also the faithful of the faithful.
right. Exactly. So, faithful of the faithful is a great way of phrasing it. And in fact, this is how Paul, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, and so forth. So, I'll give you a quick sketch. I don't think we've talked about this here before, and I'll try not to belabor it. But this is actually the heart of my academic work, is in early Judaism of this period. So, while the temple is standing, you've got, and in the time of Jesus and Paul, you've got, like I said, lots of different kinds of Judaism, but predominantly everything is focused on the temple, right? Even for the Samaritans, you've got the temple on Gerizim. So, but you have priests and Levites. Now, the priests and Levites, they're all descended from Levi. But when we see the term priests and Levites, that would seem to be redundant. But priest refers to those who are of high priestly descent. So they're from the clan of Aaron, and they could serve in a particular role in the temple, such as Elizabeth's husband, who was muted. I'll blanked on his
Zechariah.
Zechariah. Thank you. It was in my head. But then the Levites were also the clan of Levi, but they were not of the high priestly clan. So they couldn't take on high priestly duties, but they could go and do all sorts of other things. So, and you would think that represents Judaism then, right? They're preserving the Levitical law, what you do in the temple, what's clean and what's unclean. But the reality is, over the centuries, especially when the temple wasn't there, in the Babylonian exile and so forth, there developed reflection on the law as a way of replacing the physical observance in the temple. So you find already in Daniel that Daniel will pray 3 times a day towards the temple. Well, that's because he's in Babylon, and it replaces the sacrifices. His prayer at that time replaces the sacrifices. And of course, the legal material doesn't tell you how to do everything. It's an obvious thing today, right? If it says that on the Sabbath you shall do no work, we can come up with modern examples really easily. Is turning on a light switch doing work? Right? You're not allowed to kindle a fire. It says that specifically. But what about turning on a light switch? Is that kindle? So there's a whole what's called responsa literature that has existed for millennia now, about, well, how do we continue to interpret the law, right? We ask it today. We ask it in the Christian context too, right? We'll talk about questions of divorce. We'll talk about abortion. We'll talk about genetics. We'll talk about politics. And there's certain things that are explicit in Scripture, certain things that aren't. And this interpretation of the law became something that was not just the domain of the priests, but anybody who could be educated enough to do it, anybody who had the time and the wherewithal, in other words, enough luxury or money to be able to sit and study the law, could become an expert in this. And this additional traditions of interpretation is what we referred to in the Gospels as traditions of the elders, or as our New Revised Standard Version has it in Galatians, Paul writing about, I was far more zealous for the tradition of my ancestors. This, in turn, these interpretations, is something clean or unclean, is what goes into the mouth or what comes out of the mouth clean, to reference Jesus. That was what the Pharisees, who later become the rabbis, are all about. It's this oral tradition, and Gamaliel was indeed one of the, he's grandson of Hillel, the elder. This is Gamaliel, the elder. And he's referenced a couple times in the New Testament, and Acts and in the New Testament. Was one of these great sages. We refer to this particular era as the sages. And that oral tradition gets codified and written down in what's called the Mishnah, which one Jewish scholar, Jack Neusner, refers to as the Jewish New Testament, right? Because it's the next iteration. And then you've probably heard of the Talmud, which is this massive volumes of commentaries. The Talmud is interpretation of the Mishnah. So there's your little primer on rabbinic interpretation. But the point is, Paul was trained in this kind of Judaism, this detailed, pedantic understanding, not just of biblical law, but how one interprets it and applies it to life today. So one of the famous examples in the Gospels, this conflict that we see, is Jesus healing on the Sabbath, right? And our position, if you just read the Gospels, you get the impression that the Pharisees, would say that that's not allowed. Well, in fact, they debated this. We have these records of debating, can you do good on the Sabbath? You're not allowed to do any work, but what about healing someone? And Jesus brings the example, says, if you've got, I can't remember, I'm assuming it's a sheep or a goat, but for some reason in my head, it's cattle. But if you've got an animal that's stuck somewhere on the Sabbath, you're going to free that animal to protect it, to preserve its life. Now, just a quick aside, the debate, the passage I'm thinking about, and maybe others can help me, but because I always forget references, but it's with the hand that's withered, and Jesus heals the hand on the Sabbath. And of course, what the Pharisaical position would be, not that it's wrong to heal on the Sabbath. The position would be, the dude has had a wonky hand his whole life. It will still be wonky tomorrow. Wait till tomorrow and heal it tomorrow. So that's the kind of, does that make, you're just kind of looking at me, does that make sense? This is the kind of detailed, didactic and pedantic argumentation that the Pharisees were on about. And we can't say that we escape it as Christians, right? We do this all the time. Okay.
I'm sitting here thinking, isn't this period of time when Judaism withdrew from Jerusalem to, if my memory tells me correctly, Sepphoris, the Pharisees, and they are in a circling of the wagons sort of mode. And so you have Paul going against their need to survive and save themselves.
Excellent, Mac. So there are different elements of Judaism that are withdrawing and pulling themselves in different directions. So, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls reveals to us that there was a sect that pulled away physically from Jerusalem in the 2nd or 1st century BCE or BC, because they believed that the leadership at the temple in Jerusalem was not pure enough, that they weren't of the right lineage and so forth. And I wouldn't say that the Pharisees are withdrawing. As far as we can tell, their presence is very much in and around Jerusalem and Judea in this time until the destruction of the temple in 70. And then Jews are pushed out from Judea. But there's a power dynamic, a struggle between the Pharisees and those more associated with the temple, which we think are the Sadducees. I mean, the Sadducees, they're a little harder for us to define. Josephus helps us with that a little bit. My line I got from my dad, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not. Therefore, they were sad, you see. You all have heard that one, haven't you? Yeah. So there absolutely was this power dynamic and struggle between them, and it really was. I mean, it was a battle to see what kind of Judaism was going to win out. And frankly, because of the destruction of the temple in the in 70 CE, and then when they were unsuccessful in the second revolt in the 2nd century CE or AD, it really was largely the Pharisaical form of Judaism that emerges as authoritative, because it was providing a path that would allow one to remain a Jew, continue to practice your Judaism without a temple. I feel like I may have gone down a different track, Mac, than you intended.
No, not necessarily. I was just looking at the struggle for one to survive and the other one to establish themselves.
Right, exactly. Well, and it was not. I would suggest it's not clear early on which was going to win out, and it was largely the political tensions. I mean, this is the other aspect of it, right? It helps us to put into better context then what's going on in Jesus's time, and why it's such a why the gospel narratives of this debate about Jesus and what to do with him, and that there's this, I'll put on my sort of more academic hat in my language right now, the plausibility of what's going on there in terms of, is it Caiaphas who says, better that one man should die for the many, which John interprets puts in his gospel. It's a very theological statement, but there's a political statement, right? Do we want this revolt flaming up in Jerusalem and the Romans coming in and massacring thousands, which historically had happened and would happen a few decades later? Or do we go ahead and take the head off of a revolt, kill one or two people now so that we preserve the others? I mean, this is the political social dynamic that's going on. And we know it because we see two revolts that happen well after the time of Jesus. And it's in this fomenting, stirring, very dynamic. I mean, think about our social context with race relations right now and racial questions and concerns in America. This is there was sort of a theological, there was an existential crisis for Jews and Judaism in antiquity in this region. Not least because so much of identity was on the idea of a son of David being on the throne, that the occupation by Romans and so forth, and then before all the different folks before that, the Greeks and Persians and Babylonians, seemed to be saying that God had abandoned his people. So how do we understand that? There really was an existential crisis here. So what I wanted to get out, what I was hoping to sort of embellish is, think about all that I've just said about those Pharisees and so forth, and the debate. And one of my favorite examples of clean and unclean, we actually find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls too, is if I have, where's my camera? If I have a pure vessel that has pure olive oil in here, ritually pure, and then I have, I have an impure vessel. If I pour the pure olive oil, ritually pure, into the impure vessel, does the impurity travel back up and make all of the olive oil in here impure? Does it make this vessel impure? Does the pure olive oil make the impure vessel now pure? You follow me? And in our liturgical tradition, we sort of nod in this direction when we consecrate the bread and the wine, and we, after the service, we either consume the wine and the bread that's been consecrated, or we put it in the aumbry, or we pour it, if it's the wine, down the piscina, a drain that goes directly into the ground. That's exactly the kind of debate that the Pharisees were having. And Paul says, that's me. That's the kind of, to I think it was Kathy's point, the legalism, the fundamental, the zealousness. That's how he was. Now, did Paul lose that character when he met Jesus? Or did his zealousness find a new direction?
I think he was taught something new.
And what would that be? How did that change him?
Okay, so we're on vacation with family and there's little boys running around. So, and there's only Wi-Fi where there's lots of people. So sorry if we did, but
That's great. Thanks for being with us.
I didn't want to miss it. Yes, I think meeting Jesus blew everything up. And you're talking about the Jews being associated with the temple and how important the temple was. And what came to mind was Jesus was saying, I will this temple will be destroyed and in 3 days it'll be rebuilt. And it just sort of occurred to me, and I could be completely wrong about this, but how the perception was that Jesus really didn't have much respect for the temple itself, you know, and I'm sure he did, but, you know, he was turning the temple upside down. He was turning everything upside down. And I'm sure for Paul, it was just this massive paradigm shift that blew everything up for him in a good way. And that is what Jesus really does, or what conversion really does, is sort of blow everything up. Interesting to me, in a global sense, that the Jewish temple was destroyed, you know, shortly after Jesus died, relatively speaking. Everything was blown up.
Yep.
I don't know.
No, Harriet, I agree. I agree. And here is that passage in Acts where he, you know, as it's described in Acts, this vision, this light, and the voice, and we've heard this, right? This sort of calling of Shmuel, Samuel. Here it's Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? And you know, Lord is polysemious. It has many different meanings, right? Here, this is just, okay, you're somebody big and more powerful, and you're addressing me. And then he says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. By the way, I'll tell you what preaches here. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. When Christians, when followers of Jesus are being persecuted, it is Jesus who's being persecuted. But anyway, I digress. And then Paul himself in Galatians describes himself both prophetically, that you know, so this calling, like a calling of a prophet, when God, who had set me apart before I was born, like Jeremiah, called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. So we'll come back to the rest of that passage, but to Harriet's point, when that happens, it does change your world. It changes who you are. But what I wanted to also show, I hope, a little bit was there was still all the raw material of who Paul was that was now, in a sense, sanctified. Truly, not in a sense, truly was sanctified and now dedicated to promoting the gospel. But the character of Paul as a zealot remains, right? I mean, this is what turns off so many Christians today, when it is incredibly common for me when I'm at clergy conferences, especially in the Episcopal Church. I think probably true for most mainline churches. Matt can maybe tell me if I'm wrong, but there's just this kind of, because he seems outdated in terms of social and gender issues and things, to then say, oh, I hate Paul. Paul's horrible. I will never preach on Paul. And well, yeah, Paul is a tough person to deal with. His writings are challenging, for sure. But part of why he's tough to deal with and challenging, because he's persuasive, because this is his background, right? That's my point. That's what I wanted to sort of draw out, is that Paul was trained up in all of this exegesis and all of this interpretation. It's interesting and ironic. And in fact, Acts, initially, it's Peter who's supposed to go out to the Gentiles, remember? James is supposed to stay in Jerusalem. But Paul, as a diaspora Jew, that is a Jew living out in the Hellenistic diaspora, he was just more effective than Peter. So he's the one who is called to go out, and he takes that energy. And it's funny to me, the most ardent and aggressive atheists I have ever known, and I've known a lot, but almost always those who are the most aggressive atheists come from very fundamentalist backgrounds, fundamentalist Christian backgrounds, right? All they've done, and I've got a colleague and a friend here in Lexington, and I've said this to him directly, you know, his fundamentalism he had in Christianity, which I don't agree with any more than I agree with his atheism, but he's just turned around and he's now a fundamentalist atheist. The question, or the challenge I would offer, what is the word I'm looking for? Well, it's to Harriet's point and Kathy's point. When Christ breaks in, when God, through his grace, reveals his son to us, what is the transformation of those raw materials? Maybe to go back to communion and Eucharist, the wine, the inexpensive port, the little wafers, they remain more or less the same, they remain chemically, organically the same compounds, but they are sanctified. They are transformed. They become something else for us. Paul became something else for God in that time.
So can I,
Please.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, good.
So whenever you talked about modern atheists coming from fundamentalist backgrounds, my father was an atheist who was raised in a very fundamentalist background. And I had an aunt explain to me that when you grow up a certain kind of Baptist, you learn to hate sin or hate hypocrisy. Your father hated hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I like in Paul's letters, my major was rhetoric. I studied the way people make arguments, the way people become persuasive. And even just in this passage that you have on the screen right now, it's a classic rhetorical structure from Greek courtrooms,
Right.
which is you establish your bona fides, you explain how you are like and unlike that person to bring them closer to you by showing the steps by which they can become like you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing to say, God called me apart before I was born, right? I'm more special than you. If he started with that, he'd be in a very different position than if he said, you've heard no doubt of my earlier life in Judaism. He has to humble himself in order to gain credence. And I think, like in Greek courts, that's a very classic structure. So the fact that he is taking something that is Hellenistic and also, like I'm learning very, very Jewish, I think is very, very powerful because he recognizes this text is going to be speaking to both audiences in a very particular kind of way.
Absolutely, Cassie. And in fact, most of his letters, what makes them so powerful is he's using a classical epistolary formula, a letter formula from the Hellenistic period, but then he tweaks it. So what's of interest is not really, oh, look, this is just like other Greek letters, but this is like them until they're not. And in fact, what I was going to show you all, and I forgot, I'm going to bring up, because you're still seeing this, right?
Yeah.
So let me sort of get it into the screen here. So we're getting into rhetoric here, but I'm enjoying this. I hope Cassie and I are enjoying it. I hope you guys are too. But talking about Paul's Jewishness, right? So here in Galatians 15, he wants to make an argument about the nature of Jesus and his distinctiveness and his uniqueness. And look at what he does exegetically. Now, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say into offsprings, plural, spermatai, as of many, but it says into your offspring, singular. That is to one person who is Christ. Now, quickly, because I've taken too much time on this already. Right, in Hebrew and in Greek, it is using the singular, spermatis. Where is it? Anyway, yeah, spermasin. And zera in Hebrew. But like English, seed is a plural noun. You say seed, singular. You can say seeds, plural, right? I have a bag of seeds, or I have a bag of seed. This is classic midrash. Paul is using a classic rabbinic interpretive method where you take a specificity in the text. The whole context of the text, God goes on to talk to Abraham about, look at the sands of the grains of sand on the seashore. Your descendants will be more numerous than them. I mean, it's abundantly clear in Genesis that it means just what we all think it means. Paul is using the rhetoric he learned. He's using something that might resonate with the audience, which is both Hellenistic and Jewish, to make his point. So anyway, I needed to indulge in that a little bit. I hope you don't mind. All right, let me quickly, because of our time here, Paul in Romans, Paul is of course often known for being antinomian, against the law. And of course he does. He pushes back against the law as a means of salvation. And it's a very complicated question as to exactly whether Paul is really saying it. What's he saying? I mean, we have Paul arguing at one and the same time that both that Judaism brings to the awareness of the world the limitations of the law, and that we can't have full inclusion, as it were, in that way. But then at the same time, he says all Israel will be saved. And some will want to interpret that as saying the new Israel, Christianity. I don't think that's Paul. We see Paul working through this, struggling as he's writing, as he's dictating these letters. But this truly shapes Christianity theologically. This is the power of Paul. He does so much in terms of our theology. And, in particular, that we are justified by faith. And then at the same time, it's not that Paul says that nothing can bind us, right? We see this in Acts 15 with the Jerusalem Council. We don't have to keep all the old law, but it's not like there aren't any laws binding us. And I just brought this one up about eating food sacrificed to idols. So what you're seeing, one commentator I was looking at this week in preparing said, it's not like Paul had a systematic theology that he just then imposed. We see Paul in his letters moment by moment reacting and responding to the concerns in any given circumstance. And trying to he's developing and shaping what I would describe as a consistent hermeneutic. Okay, the cultic laws don't apply. Which laws still do? As far as Paul is concerned, in Greek, this problematic term porneia, for example, depends on sexual immorality is probably the best broad translation. Paul says porneia is something you can't do. Well, what does that mean? We wrestle with this today. I brought this one because I felt like it was a little less problematic. Although friends of mine from Indonesia pointed out to me, it is still a living challenge where meat can be sacrificed to idols and then you have it at dinner. Can we eat something that others have sacrificed to idols? And in this whole extended passage, worth looking at, because you see Paul walking through this going, well, it's permissible for us because we know there aren't any other gods. We know that it's kind of nonsense. It doesn't make any difference. But then he turns around and he says, but wait a minute. It may not be a sin for you, but what about the other people around you? Maybe they have not yet come to that maturity. Don't bring them down. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything's clean, but it's wrong for you to make others fall by what you eat. And I in my household, where in the extended family there were alcoholics, it ended up in my family a very ardent never drink. In my life, it's developed to the people I know around me, I don't drink in front of, because for them it could potentially lead them in a dangerous direction. It's not a problem for me. I'm a little goody two-shoes. I've never been drunk in all my life. But I know that's not true for other friends, right? And so Paul is at one time saying law doesn't bind us, law does not bring salvation, but that doesn't mean that we are lawless. And this is a tension and a struggle that we continue to wrestle with. He also provides the most clear articulations and fervent assertions about our faith. And it all comes to the resurrection for Paul. And 1 Corinthians 15, and if you join me this fall for reading my book, we come back to this again and again, the importance of the resurrection. And some of this, as you can tell, now that we've talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, there is a certain amount of, Paul's already gone through these arguments in a Jewish context. And my guess is part of what persuaded him to accept Jesus as the risen Messiah is because he had already gone through it and come to the conviction that, yes, Scripture does tell us that there will be a bodily resurrection. And now he teaches that Jesus is the first of those to be raised from the dead. And I will say, for me, in grief, it was hearing, I mean, I knew these passages, but it was the Easter after our son had died. And it's not like I had forgotten them, but this was what the pastor at my parents' church was preaching from. And I was like, all right, do I believe it or not? Do I believe it or not? And this is, that whole section, 1 Corinthians 15, incredibly important. And I will say this is, to be a little bit punny, this is the crux of it all. So we may argue and wrestle about Paul's, shall we call it, social teachings. And there are plenty of people who don't like his theological teachings as well. But this is the heart of Christianity. And if the prophets were sent to help Israel understand how to apply the law to the way they lived their lives, I think Paul was sent to help us understand how we're to live the life and the truth of the resurrected Jesus. Well, I, again, took too much time, probably on too many tangents regarding rabbinic Judaism and things like that. Thoughts and questions before we close?
One is, I don't know what we're doing for next time.
Jesus, that'll be my last slide. See, Jesus. I'm not going to give you any reading assignments. We read the Gospels again and again. You know, if you want to pick one, I would say, you know, Mark is a very easy, short read. John is quite, you know, John is characterized usually as much more theological gospel. So if you wanted to read, I would say Matthew or Mark, and we'll look at Jesus. Now that next week, as I said, Henry's invited me to preach, so I'll have to be a little quicker in finishing on time at 10 till.
Yes.
Any other comments or thoughts?
Thank you so much for today.
Oh, you're welcome.
I really appreciate today too, and how much we can talk about Paul's theology. It's just amazing, the gift to the church that his theology is.
Thank you, Amy. And Amy, 2 weeks ago, I met a former friend of yours who's now at Iowa, who did his PhD here.
Yes, he told me all about it. Michael Tilley. He was very pleased with your work.
Oh, well, it was fun to, he knows a mentor and friend of mine that you all will read all about in the book, Arnie Anderson.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Paul is someone I really wrestle with. I grew up in a mildly Calvinist context. That particular church has become very Calvinist. And it was one of the really important struggles for me was the question of election and free will, right? What I came down with is when I read fully Paul, not even putting in the fuller context of Scripture, but even Paul himself is back and forth about this, right? Paul continues to preach to us and call us to repent and convert and to come into the resurrected life. And if it was all predestined and ordained, I don't think Paul would do that. If he really believed that it was God had manufactured all of it and was directing it, and there's nothing we could do one way or the other. But I just, like with a lot of friends who are caustic or rough, I have generally found Paul is much more, there's much more to be gained for me anyway in my life by engaging with him rather than walking away from him. So Paul also has given us some of our most beautiful benedictions and prayers. So the Lord be with you.
Also,
Also with you.
Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine, to him be the glory and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
And thank you
Thank-
so much.
Thank you all very much. We're going to talk about Jesus. And again, I think we're going to focus in this context on his life, trying to sort of take, in some ways, kind of a minimalist approach. It will be very thumbnail, obviously, in the time that we have. But go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.